Second Chance Ministry Radio proudly presents Christmas Stories from the Heart. Enjoy and have a glorious day.
Christmas Treasures by Martin Luther. Were earth 1,000 times as fair, beset with gold and jewels rare, she yet would far too poor to be a narrow cradle, Lord, for thee. The Manger Was Empty, retold by Cassandra Lindell. He arrived early on Christmas morning to give the church a thorough inspection, noting with approval that the aisles and seats had been swept and dusted after the midnight Christmas Eve service. Any lost purses, Bibles, and gloves had been collected and sent to the office where the lost and found box was kept. Every forgotten flyer and bulletin insert had been rounded up and discarded. Outside it was just beginning to grow light. In the church, where only the pastor moved, candles flickered and threw shifting shadows on the arches and the stone floor. Occasionally, stray candlelight picked out the rich colors in the stained glass windows. It was cold, and except for the pastor's slow tread, it was silent. He paused beside the almost life-size nativity scene to say a Christmas prayer of thanksgiving to the one whose birth is celebrated. The figures, each lovingly crafted with wonderful realism, sat on a small stage. A night sky and the star that led the shepherds and the wise men to the Messiah on the day of his birth could be seen through the open door of the stable. The shepherds were just entering, eyes wide in obvious awe. Various kinds of livestock stood in the stalls or lay on the edges of the scene, and in the center was the Holy Family. Looking at the manger scene, the pastor could almost feel the reverence of that long-ago night. Slowly, a puzzled frown crept across his brow. Then his choked gasp rustled through the empty church. The manger was empty. The small figure representing the infant Savior was gone. Hurriedly and with growing agitation, the pastor began to search the church again. Starting by the manger, he peered back through the aisles, nearly crawling on his hands and knees to see all the way under each seat. But there was nothing. Next, he called the custodian, thinking he may have seen the figure of the infant Jesus. Then he called the assistant pastor and all the elders, but no one had any explanation. In the end, each shaking his head sorrowfully, they accepted the truth they had all been trying to avoid. The figure could not have been mislaid or lost. It must have been stolen. With solemnity befitting the occasion, the pastor reported the theft to the congregation that assembled not long after. His voice trembled as he told them what he'd found earlier that morning. For a person to steal the very symbol of their reason for celebrating, he said, their very reason for hope, well, he just did not understand. His gaze swept over the faces in the early morning congregation, disappointed to think someone in his own congregation might do such a thing. The figure of the Christ child, he said, must be returned before this Christmas day is over. No one will ask any questions, but it must be brought back immediately. Then he slipped from the pulpit, and the choir closed the service with a Christmas hymn, "O come, let us adore him." The manger remained empty throughout the day. Toward the end of the afternoon, discouraged and heavy-hearted, the pastor took a walk through the wintry streets of the neighborhood. Ahead of him, he saw one of the youngest members of his flock, a 6-year-old named Tommy. Bundled shabbily against the cold, Tommy trudged up the sidewalk, proudly dragging behind him a toy express wagon. It was bright and red and obviously Christmas new. Knowing what sacrifice and scrimping the purchase of this toy must have meant, Tommy's family could barely make ends meet. The pastor was deeply touched. The love Tommy's parents had for their little boy gave the pastor's heart a gentle warmth, and he felt his faith in human nature beginning to return. He sped up so he could wish Tommy a Merry Christmas and admire the beautiful wagon. But as he drew nearer, he saw that the wagon was not empty. There lay the baby Jesus, now wrapped and blanketed but not quite hidden. The pastor crouched down beside Tommy. one knee feeling the damp snow through his pant leg. His face was grim and disappointed. Tommy may be just a little boy, and one must make allowances, of course, but he was still old enough to understand that stealing was very wrong. The pastor made this crystal clear to Tommy while the little boy stood, his seemingly guiltless clear eyes filling with what the pastor was sure were penitent tears. "But, Pastor," the small boy quavered when at last the man finished talking, "I didn't steal, Jesus. It wasn't like that at all." He paused to swallow hard and wipe a few tears away. "It's just that I've been asking him for a red wagon as a Christmas present for a long time, and I promised him that when I got it, I'd take him out for the first ride." Trouble at the Inn by Dina Donahue, from Guidepost magazine. Wally was 9 that year and in the 2nd grade, though he should have been in the 4th. Most people in town knew that he had difficulty in keeping up. He was big and clumsy, slow in movement and mind. Still, Wally was well liked by the other children in his class, all of whom were smaller than he, though the boys had trouble hiding their irritation when Wally would ask to play ball with them, or play any game for that matter in which winning was most important. Most often they would find a way to keep him out, but Wally would hang around anyway, not sulking, just hoping. He was always a helpful boy, a willing and smiling one, and the natural protector, paradoxically, of the underdog. Sometimes, if the older boys chased the younger ones away, it would always be Wally who'd say, "Can't they stay? They're no bother." Wally fancied the idea of being a shepherd with a flute in the Christmas pageant that year, but the play's director, Miss Lombard, assigned him to a more important role. After all, she reasoned, the innkeeper did not have too many lines, and Wally's size would make his refusal of lodging to Joseph more forceful. And so it happened that the usual large audience gathered for the town's yearly extravaganza of creches, beards, crowns, halos, and a whole stage full of squeaky voices. No one on stage or off was more caught up in the magic of the night than Wallace Perling. They said later that he stood in the wings and watched the performance with such fascination that from time to time Miss Lombard had to make sure he didn't wander on stage before his cue. Then the time came when Joseph appeared, slowly, tenderly guiding Mary to the door of the inn. Joseph knocked hard on the wooden door set into the painted backdrop. Wally the innkeeper was there, waiting. "What do you want?" demanded Wally, swinging the door open with a brusque gesture. "We seek lodging." "Seek it elsewhere." Wally looked straight ahead, but spoke vigorously. "The inn is filled." "Sir, we have asked everywhere in vain. We've traveled far and are very weary." "There is no room in this inn for you." Wally looked properly stern. "Please, good innkeeper, this is my wife Mary. She's heavy with child and needs a place to rest. Surely you must have some small corner for her. She's so tired." Now, for the first time, the innkeeper relaxed his stiff stance and looked down at Mary. With that, there was a long pause, long enough to make the audience a bit tense with embarrassment. "No, be gone," the prompter whispered from the wings. "No," Wally repeated automatically. "Be gone." Joseph placed his arm around Mary, and Mary laid her head upon her husband's shoulder, and the two of them started to move away. The innkeeper did not return inside his inn, however. Wally stood there in the doorway, watching the forlorn couple. His mouth was open, his brow creased with concern, his eyes filling unmistakably with tears. And suddenly, this Christmas pageant became different from all others. "Don't go, Joseph," Wally called out. "Bring Mary back." And Wallace Perling's face grew into a bright smile. "You can have my room." The Gold and Ivory Tablecloth by Howard C. Shade, reprinted with permission from the December 1954 Reader's Digest Association, Incorporated. At Christmas time, men and women everywhere gather in their churches to wonder anew at the greatest miracle the world has ever known. But the story I like best to recall was not a miracle, not exactly. It happened to a pastor who was very young. His church was very old. Once, long ago, it had flourished. Famous men had preached from its pulpit, prayed before its altar. Rich and poor alike worshipped there and built it beautifully. Now the good days had passed from the section of town where it stood. But the pastor and his young wife believed in their run-down church. They felt that with paint, hammer, and faith they could get it in shape. Together they went to work. But in late December, a severe storm whipped through the river valley, and the worst blow fell on the little church. A huge chunk of rain-soaked plaster fell out of the inside wall just behind the altar. Sorrowfully, the pastor and his wife swept away the mess, but they couldn't hide the ragged hole. The pastor looked at it and had to remind himself quickly, "Thy will be done." But his wife wept. Christmas is only 2 days away. That afternoon, the dispirited couple attended the auction held for the benefit of a youth group. The auctioneer opened a box and shook out of its folds a handsome gold and ivory lace tablecloth. It was a magnificent item nearly 15 feet long. But it, too, dated from a long-vanished era. Who today had any use for such a thing? There were a few half-hearted bids. Then the pastor was seized with what he thought was a great idea. He bid it in for $6.50. He carried the cloth back to the church and tacked it up on the wall behind the altar. It completely hid the hole, and the extraordinary beauty of its shimmering handwork cast a fine holiday glow over the chancel. It was a great triumph. Happily, he went back to preparing his Christmas sermon. Just before noon on the day of Christmas Eve, as the pastor was opening the church, he noticed a woman standing in the cold at the bus stop. "The bus won't be here for 40 minutes, he called, and invited her into the church to get warm. She told him that she had come from the city that morning to be interviewed for a job as governess to the children of one of the wealthy families in town, but she'd been turned down. A war refugee, her English was imperfect. The woman sat down in a pew and chafed her hands and rested. After a while, she dropped her head and prayed. She looked up as the pastor began to adjust the great ivory and gold lace cloth across the hole. She rose suddenly and walked up the steps of the chancel. She looked at the tablecloth. The pastor smiled and started to tell her about the storm damage, but she didn't seem to listen. She took up a fold of the cloth and rubbed it between her fingers. "It is mine," she said. "It is my banquet cloth." She lifted the corner and showed the surprised pastor that there were initials monogrammed on it. "My husband had the cloth made especially for me in Brussels. There could not be another like it." For the next few minutes the woman and the pastor talked excitedly together. She explained that she was Viennese, that she and her husband had opposed the Nazis and decided to leave the country. They were advised to go separately. Her husband put her on a train for Switzerland. They planned that he would join her as soon as he could arrange to ship their household goods across the border. She never saw him again. Later, she heard that he had died in a concentration camp. "I have always felt that it was my fault to leave without him," she said. "Perhaps these years of wandering have been my punishment." The pastor tried to comfort her and urged her to take the cloth with her. She refused. Then she went away. As the church began to fill on Christmas Eve, it was clear that the cloth was going to be a great success. It had been skillfully designed to look its best by candlelight. After the service, the pastor stood in the doorway. Many people told him that the church looked beautiful. One gentle-faced, middle-aged man, he was the local clock and watch repairman, looked rather puzzled. "It is strange," he said in his soft accent. "Many years ago, my wife, God rest her, and I owned such a cloth. In our home in Vienna, my wife put it on the table." Here he smiled. "Only when the bishop came to dinner." The pastor suddenly became very excited. He told the jeweler about the woman who had been in the church earlier in the day. The startled jeweler clutched the pastor's arm. "Can it be? Does she live?" Together, the two got in touch with the family who had interviewed her. Then, in the pastor's car, they started for the city. And as Christmas Day was born, this man and his wife, who had been separated through so many saddened Yuletides, were reunited. To all who heard this story, the joyful purpose of the storm that knocked a hole in the wall of the church was now quite clear. Of course, people said it was a miracle. and I think you will agree it was the season for it. Take Hold of Love by Henry Carter from Guidepost Magazine. I was working feverishly on my Christmas sermon, the hardest time in any minister's year to find something fresh to say, when the floor mother appeared at the study door. Another crisis upstairs. Christmas Eve is a difficult day for the emotionally disturbed children in our church home. 3/4 of them go home at least overnight, and the ones who remain react to the empty beds and the changed routine. I followed her up the stairs, chafing inwardly at the repeated interruptions. This time it was Tommy. He had crawled under a bed and refused to come out. The woman pointed to one of the 6 cots in the small dormitory. Not a hair or a shoe showed beneath. So I addressed myself to the cowboys and bucking broncos on the bedspread. I talked about the brightly lighted tree in the church vestibule next door, and the packages underneath it, and all the other good things waiting for him out beyond that bed. No answer. Still fretting at the time this was costing, I dropped to my hands and knees and lifted the spread. 2 enormous blue eyes met mine. Tommy was 8, but looked like a 5-year-old. It would have been no effort at all simply to pull him out. But it wasn't pulling Tommy needed. It was trust and a sense of deciding things on his own initiative. So, crouched there on all fours, I launched into the menu of the special Christmas Eve supper to be offered after the service. I told him about the stocking with his name on it provided by the Women's Society. Silence. There was no indication that he either heard me or cared about Christmas. And at last, because I could think of no other way to make contact, I got down on my stomach and wriggled in beside him, bedspring snagging my suit jacket. For what seemed a long time, I lay there with my cheek pressed against the floor. At first I talked about the big wreath above the altar and the candles in the windows. I reminded him of the carol he and the other children were going to sing. Then I ran out of things to say and simply waited there beside him. And as I waited, a small, chilled hand crept into mine. "You know, Tommy," I said after a bit, "it's kind of close quarters under here. Let's you and me go out where we can stand up." And so we did, but slowly, in no hurry. All the pressures had gone from my day, because, you see, I had my Christmas sermon. Flattened there on the floor, I realized I had been given a new glimpse of the mystery of this season. Hadn't God called us too, as I'd called Tommy from far above us? With his stars and mountains, his whole majestic creation, hadn't he pleaded with us to love him, to enjoy the universe he gave us? And when we would not listen, he had drawn closer. Through prophets and lawgivers and holy men, he spoke with us face to face. But it was not until that first Christmas, until God stooped to earth itself, until he took our very place and came to dwell with us in our loneliness and alienation, that we, like Tommy, dared to stretch out our hands to take hold of love. If you're missing baby Jesus, call 7162 by Jean Getson. When I was a child, my father worked for an oil company in North Dakota. The company moved him around to different parts of the state, and at some point between one move and another, we lost our family nativity set. Shortly before Christmas in 1943, my mother decided to replace it and was happy to find another at our local 5 and Dime for only $3.99. When my brother Tom and I helped her unpack the set, we discovered 2 figures of the baby Jesus. "Someone must have packaged this wrong," my mother said, counting out the figures. "We have 1 Joseph, 1 Mary, 3 wise men, 3 shepherds, 2 lambs, a donkey, a cow, an angel, and 2 babies. Oh dear, I suppose some set down at the store is missing a baby Jesus." "Hey, that's great, Mom," my brother and I shouted. "Now we have twins." "You 2 run back down to the store and tell the manager that we have an extra Jesus. Tell him to put a sign on the remaining boxes saying that if a set is missing a baby Jesus, call 7162, my mother instructed. "I'll give each of you a penny for some candy. And don't forget your mufflers. It's freezing cold out there." The manager of the store copied down my mother's message, and the next time we were in the store, we saw the cardboard sign that read, "If you're missing baby Jesus, call 7162. All week long we waited for the call to come. Surely we thought someone was missing the important figurine. Each time the phone rang, my mother would say, "I'll bet that's about Jesus." But it never was. My father tried to explain that the figurine could be missing from a set in Walla Walla, Washington, and that packing errors occurred all the time. He suggested we just put the extra Jesus back in the box and forget about it. "Back in the box?" I wailed. "What a terrible thing to do to the baby Jesus, and at Christmas time, too." "Surely someone will call," my mother said. "We'll just keep them together in the manger until someone calls." When no call had come by 5 o'clock on Christmas Eve, my mother insisted that my father just run down to the store to see if there were any sets left. "You can see them right through the window, over on the counter," she said. "If they're all gone, I'll know someone is bound to call tonight." "Run down to the store?" my father thundered. "It's 15 degrees below zero out there." "Oh, Daddy, we'll go with you," I said. "Tommy and I'll bundle up good, and we can look at all the decorations on the way." My father gave a long sigh and headed for the front closet. "I can't believe I'm doing this," he muttered. "Each time the phone rings, everyone yells at me to see if it's about Jesus, and now I'm going off on the coldest night of the year to peek in a window to see if he's there or not there." My father muttered all the way down the block while my brother and I raced each other up to the window where the tiny lights flickered on and off around the frame. "They're all gone, Daddy," I shouted. "Every set must be sold." "Hooray, hooray!" my brother joined in, catching up with me. "The mystery will be solved tonight." My father, who had remained several steps behind us, turned on his heel and headed back home. Inside the house once more, we saw that the extra figurine had vanished from the set, and my mother appeared to have vanished too. Someone must have called, and she went out to deliver the figurine, my father reasoned, pulling off his boots. "You kids get busy stringing popcorn strands for the tree, and I'll wrap your mother's present." We'd almost completed one strand when the phone rang. My father yelled for me to answer it. "Tell him we found a home for Jesus," he called down the steps. But the caller was not an inquirer. It was my mother with instructions for us to come to 205 Chestnut Street immediately and bring 3 blankets, a box of cookies, and some milk. "Now what has she gotten us into?" my father groaned as we bundled up again. 205 Chestnut Street. Well, that's about 8 blocks away. Wrap that milk up good in the blankets or it'll turn to ice by the time we get there. Why in the name of heaven can't we all just get on with Christmas? It's probably 20 degrees below out there now, and the wind is picking up. Of all the crazy things to do on a night like this. Tommy and I sang Christmas songs at the top of our lungs all the way to Chestnut Street. My father, carrying his bundle of blankets and milk, looked for all the world like St. Nicholas himself with his arms full of goodies. Every now and then my brother would call back to him, "Let's pretend we're looking for a place to stay, Dad, just like Joseph and Mary." "Let's pretend we're in Bethlehem, where it's probably 65 degrees in the shade right now," my father would answer. The house at 205 Chestnut Street turned out to be the darkest one on the block. One tiny light burned in the living room, and at the moment we set foot on the front porch, my mother opened the door and shouted, "They're here! They're here!" "Oh, thank God you got here, Ray. You kids take those blankets into the living room and wrap up the little ones on the couch. I'll take the milk and cookies." "Would you mind telling me what is going on, Ethel?" my father asked. "We have just walked through below-zero weather with the wind in our faces all the way." "Never mind all that now," my mother interrupted. "There's no heat in this house, and this young mother is so upset she doesn't know what to do. Her husband walked out on her, and these poor children will have to spend a very bleak Christmas, so don't you complain. I told her you could fix that oil furnace in a jiffy." My mother strode off to the kitchen to warm the milk while my brother and I wrapped up the 5 little children who were huddled together on the couch. The children's mother explained to my father that her husband had run off, taking bedding, clothing, and almost every piece of furniture, but she'd been doing all right until the furnace broke down.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.